Somebody is going to sign offensive lineman Connor Williams, despite the fact that he's coming off of a torn ACL this season, and there is no reason the Washington Commanders can't be that team. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, David Harrison, credentialed member of the media covering your Washington Commanders for CommanderGameDay.com, a part of Sports Illustrated. I'm here with you every Monday through Friday. Greatly appreciate you coming through today, everydayers. I appreciate all of you for coming through every day. Don't forget that you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this podcast if you haven't done so already. On today's episode, Dan Quinn may not have a deadline for setting his starting offensive line, but I do, for whatever that's worth. And we're going to talk about fantasy and real values about some Commanders personnel and players. But first, offensive lineman Connor Williams was on his way to a big payday this offseason, and then he tore his ACL. Now his future is in question, but the Commanders should be in on the conversation about that future coming through DC. That is our top conversation today. If you want to discuss that or anything else in this episode with me or anything else Washington Commanders related in general, you got questions, I got answers. All you got to do is hit me up via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders today. And then from there, all you got to do is text me. Plus, you're going to receive one-on-one conversations with me, inside information, analysis, bonus content, all kinds of communications throughout the offseason, the dead period, practices, press conferences, games, you name it, you're going to get a little bit of everything. So go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders and sign up for that today. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create your account, use the code LOCKEDONNFL, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Offensive lineman Connor Williams, one of the best interior offensive linemen in the NFL, all the way up until the day he tore his ACL. And this mailbag episode is going to be kicked off by Merle, who came through, Insider Merle, and asked, I got one. Should the Commanders try to sign Connor Williams to compete at left guard or center? Last year, he was rated the #1 center according to PFF. And bottom line is, yes, I think the Washington Commanders should absolutely be in that conversation. Now, obviously, there's two sides of that conversation. Connor Williams has to choose to come to Washington as well or want to come to Washington as well. But I think that if you're the Washington Commanders and if you're truly going out there trying to find the best players for this team this year and into the future, you have to at least call the guy. You have to at least have the conversation, ask about the medicals. How is the recovery going? All of those things. We got an update on Connor Williams' status from Adam Schefter on Tuesday, or on Wednesday, rather. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But when you just look at who Connor was pre-injury, right? 3rd ranked center in run blocking, 14th ranked center in pass blocking in 2023. Now, grain of salt here, he's not going to come to Washington, if he does come to Washington, to be the center. That job belongs to Tyler Biadasz. I don't think that's a competition. I don't think they're looking for competition there. They signed him to a 3-year deal, brought him from the Dallas Cowboys. Dan Quinn, Joey Jr. know him very well. Tyler Biadasz is here to be the starting center. Now, if that changes, it's going to be through his play, not through bringing in another veteran free agent and having a training camp battle. That's just the way that I see it right now. But Connor Williams did just turn 27, so you can get some good years out of him. And if he's willing to play left guard, then you certainly have a discussion to have there. The last time he played guard, he played at left guard, which is where we currently have Nick Allegretti penciled in on this show for the Washington Commanders depth chart. That was back in 2021 when Connor Williams last played left guard. When he did that, he was the 14th ranked run blocking guard in 2021 and the 17th ranked pass blocking guard. So pretty good numbers, not great, not Hall of Fame necessarily, but pretty solid numbers for an interior offensive line. So I think question number one in this conversation has to be, is Connor Williams willing to move back to guard? I don't know the answer to that. So that's a question of the Washington Commanders, general manager Adam Peters, all those guys. They would have to ask that question first and foremost. If Connor Williams is not willing, then you can just kind of move on, I think, and continue about your business. If he is willing, then I think you take that conversation to the next step. And that, of course, would be, what kind of contract are you looking for? Again, you're coming off of an ACL. So Adam Schefter of ESPN reporting on Wednesday, quote, former Cowboys and Dolphins free agent center Connor Williams, who is coming off season-ending knee surgery, expects to be ready for the start of the season and is in discussions with multiple teams about where to play in 2024. He plans to pick his new team before training camp begins, end quote. So that's good news for Connor Williams. Obviously, this ACL injury is not scaring away everybody. It's certainly going to scare away some people, But like Adam Schefter reported there, he's getting some interest. And again, this information most likely coming from Connor Williams' agent. That's fine as long as it's true, which you have to say with a grain of salt as well. But assuming there were multiple teams out here looking at him, look, that's a very serious injury. And the wording of where to play kind of interests me, because in the beginning of Adam Schefter's report, he does say center, right? He calls him a center specifically, but then he talks about where to play. Now, obviously that could be geographical, but it could also be positional. So I kind of looked and I tried to look. There's actually not much of a history of offensive linemen tearing their ACL and then signing a new contract the very next offseason. But when you think about the guys who have gotten new deals after tearing an ACL, they're usually, if not always, one-year deals, right? Because it just makes sense for the team that's signing you. They want to make sure you're healthy. They want to make sure you're good to go. They want to make sure they're not going to engage themselves or tie themselves to a 3, 4, or 5-year deal with someone that they're never going to get meaningful snaps out of. So it just makes business sense in the National Football League on why you would get a 1-year deal. Now, for Connor Williams, that really kind of bites because, again, he was on his way to quite the payday, quite the contract coming up this offseason before he got hurt. And when you look at the offensive line, especially interior offensive line, I mean, you're the guys, you're pushing, people are landing on you. People are pushing up against you. You got to be able to get leverage and move the line of scrimmage, reset the line of scrimmage, or a worst case scenario, you got to be able to at least anchor down, get your cleats in the dirt, hold your ground, and not let yourself get pushed back in the pocket. That's all legs, right? That's all legs. There's obvious upper body, but the lower body, a very, very important part of playing offensive line. So I would be good with a 1-year deal. And I think that's likely what Connor Williams is going to sign. There might be a team that just needs him so much or loves him so much or wants him so bad that they're willing to tack on a couple of extra years. Most likely the pay distribution would not actually tie them down to those next 2 or 3 years, whatever it is on the deal. But I think he's most likely to get a 1-year deal. And if you're the Washington Commanders, that's exactly the kind of deal you're going to look to bring him in, because you're also going to do it under the conversation of you're not guaranteed anything, right? Because this team needs to get their starting offensive line in place. They need to get their quarterback protected. So unless we think we absolutely need to plug you in, there's a possibility that you're going to lose this job. We're going to let Nick Allegretti compete for that position. And again, so what kind of mindset is Connor Williams coming to this thing as well? However, one thing we do know, again, thanks to Adam Schefter over at ESPN, Williams apparently expects to be signed by a team by the start of training camp and will return by the start of the season. That is, again, to me, where the problem lies, because I've got a date in mind. Dan Quinn doesn't have a date in mind, but I've got a date in mind where I think this offensive line needs to be set. It is before the start of the regular season. It is during training camp, during the preseason. And truthfully, if that offensive line top 5, starting 5 is not set by this date, I will probably start having some questions as to whether or not this team needs to get picking up a little bit and maybe is making a mistake on waiting too long with that unit. I will give you that date and why coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders brought to you by Game Time. Game Time makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to a lot of events, and they've also got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time literally takes the guesswork out of buying your tickets. The Edmonton Oilers pulled out a Game 5 win over the Florida Panthers and have forced a Game 6 back on their home ice, Edmonton's, against those Florida Panthers. That game is on Friday night. If you want to catch that at Rogers Place, it'll cost you $1,300 to do so or more right now. However, if you're local to Washington, D.C., and you don't watch hockey on television, then you can spend your Friday night listening to Hardy at Jiffy Lube Live for as little as $36. Whatever it is you want to do, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create your account, use the code LOCKEDONNFL to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create your account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks again for making Locked On Commanders your first listen, your first view today and every day. Everydayers, thanks for coming through on a regular basis like you do. We will have another episode dropping tomorrow to wrap up this week of Locked On Commanders content. And in the meantime, if you just need that sports fix, make sure you check out Locked On Sports Today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news. Again, 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So While I do believe that, yes, it would be wise, and I do hope that the Washington Commanders are at least engaging in conversation with Connor Williams and his crew about his return and his health status and all these things, the terminology of expects to be ready by the beginning of the regular season kind of tells me you're most likely not going to be ready to practice in training camp, not going to be ready to play in the preseason. And when you have a team like Washington who has a rookie quarterback and you've got so many new pieces of this offensive line, well, 2/5 of this offensive line are going to be new starters. 3/5 including Tyler, to be honest, but those three are set, right? The center, the right guard, right tackle, we believe are pretty much set. The left guard, the left tackle still need to be figured out. The question now comes, can you be patient enough and basically pencil Connor Williams in there as your starter without actually seeing him take a rep in preseason and training camp? Because that's circumstances, that's a tough pill to swallow personally. And I don't believe the Washington Commanders would probably take that step. I think if that is the case where Connor Williams is not going to be able to give you practice reps, is not going to be able to give you preseason reps, but week one, hey, I plan to be there, I don't think the Washington Commanders go that direction. So just kind of setting the stage for that, because they do at some point need to have a set 5, and they need that set 5 to get as comfortable as possible together. And they need to let Jaden Daniels get comfortable behind that set 5. Again, once he's announced as a starting quarterback, which we do expect to happen at some point in the very relatively near future. Anyway, so I asked Dan Quinn at the end of the mandatory minicamp at his press conference with us if he had a kind of a ballpark, whether it be a day or a time period or a part of the phase where he wants to have the starting 5 offensive line set. And he said he doesn't. He doesn't have a date circled. They're just going to kind of do that when the time is right and all those things. And that's a perfectly fine answer and a perfectly reasonable answer. But I do have a date set. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Dan Quinn, if he really had to think about it, probably might have the same date set. But honestly, probably just hasn't sat down and say, here's what I need to figure it out. James came through and asked, he said, clearly you think that they need to have a set date. And I do. So he asked me what mine is. Mine's August 21st. August 21st, 2024. No later than that day, the Washington Commanders need to have a set starting 5 for their offensive line. So again, with Connor Williams, or a guy like him, if he can't be ready to practice by August 21st, that kind of eliminates the potential of bringing him in there if you follow that schedule that I have set forth, which again, I'm on this end of the whole thing. So, that's a big question to ask, is whether or not they would agree with that. So August 21st, why August 21st? Well, it's following the second preseason game, because I think you're going to continue to see a lot of rotations through training camp in the preseason, different combinations of left tackle, left guard, all this other stuff. Try to figure out guys. And again, it's really hard to fully evaluate your offensive line until the pads come on. Even when the pads come on and you're going team on team, it's still kind of hard, because like Dorrance Armstrong is not going to go out there and just try to demolish his own left tackle, right? At least he shouldn't be. But you're going to get joint practices against the New York Jets and the Miami Dolphins. Those are going to be incredibly valuable, because I'll tell you what, you want to know what the New York Jets defensive ends, pass rushers, and the Miami Dolphins defensive ends, pass rushers don't care about. They don't care about the Washington Commanders left tackle, left guard, their welfare. They just don't. They care about their own welfare. So they're going to give them everything they got, all the smoke they got, which is why there's going to be fights, which is why there's going to be shoving, all of those things. But you're going to get an opportunity to really see them in action. Then you're going to get the New York Jets preseason game. You're going to get the Miami Dolphins preseason game. Following that Miami Dolphins preseason game, you have had enough time now to put so many combinations in against your own defense in pads, against the New York Jets defense in pads, against the Miami Dolphins defense in pads. You should be able to make a decision on who your starting 5 are following that, and returning to practice the following week. You should be able to make a decision on who that starting 5 is, whether you formally announce it or not or whatever. It is irrelevant, right? And August 21st is actually a couple of days. I think it's 2 or 3 days following that second preseason game, because, let's not, I don't want to get too crazy and be like, on the flight home, you should know. So let's give them some wiggle room, a couple of days to breathe or whatever. But August 21st also is a nice round number. It's 20 days before the season kicks off. Week 1 in Tampa Bay, September 9th. That gives you 20 days, and you're not going to work every single one of those days, but it gives you 20 calendar days to get that starting 5, as many reps as possible, put Jaden behind them, give him as many reps as possible. So that is my date. August 21st, I would like to see this team have a starting 5 set no later than that. The earlier, the better. Fantastic, but no earlier or no later than August 21st. Moving on to Corey here in the mailbag. Corey says, do you think that with all the different coaching philosophies, and the Commanders are creating a hybrid defense and a hybrid offense? Well, Corey, first of all, thank you for the question, Insider Corey. And I want to point out to all insiders, this is evidence that none of your questions go in the trash bin, because Corey will know he asked this question a while ago, right? But because of everything going on, everything that kind of took priority over everything else, it kept getting pushed down. But Corey, here it is. We're able to answer it here now that we're kind of in this period between minicamp and training camp. And here's what, and I like the fact that we've had the opportunity to wait, because it's given me much more of an opportunity to really study what's going on with these phases of the game, the offense, defense, special teams. Special teams, by the way, it's kind of a whole new animal because we got a whole lot of things going on, especially with this new kickoff rule. So I don't really want to call that anything, but I would not call the offensive defense hybrids. What I would call them is fusion, or really I'm going to call the offense fusion. And here's why. And I'm getting, we're talking about semantics here, right? But hybrids combine different elements or systems. Fusion merges and merges, combining is another word, but merges them together to create a new component, right? So that's why I use that word. I don't think what you're going to see is like Cliff Kingsbury's. You can say this is Cliff Kingsbury's offense, this part is Brian Johnson's offense, this part is Anthony Lynn's offense. Those three pieces, they all come together. You stack them up and you have the Washington Commanders offense. What I think you're going to have is you're going to have influences from all three of those guys, and they're going to blend together and meld into a new system. And I use those guys specifically because Cliff Kingsbury obviously is the offensive coordinator. Anthony Lynn was most recently the Lions offensive coordinator in 2021. He is the run game coordinator for the Washington Commanders offense. Brian Johnson was most recently the Eagles offensive coordinator in 2023. He is the pass game coordinator for the Washington Commanders offense. I think that they built this coaching staff this way for a reason, and it's not so that Anthony Lynn and Brian Johnson come over here and just be gophers for Cliff Kingsbury. No, I think they like what Cliff Kingsbury brings, but they want the influences of Anthony Lynn and Brian Johnson as well. So like I said, merge it. Make it, it's going to be a fusion type of offense. You're going to see little bits and pieces here. So for example, in 2022, Cliff Kingsbury's last year as a head coach of the Arizona Cardinals, they were in 11 personnel 64% of the time. Anthony Lynn, 62% of the time with the Lions in 2021. Brian Johnson in 2023, 69% of the time. So you're going to see 60+% usage of 11 personnel. However, Cliff Kingsbury and Anthony Lynn both were in 12 personnel a good amount of time, but Cliff Kingsbury was in 12 30% of the time, while Anthony Lynn was only in 12 11% of the time. Brian Johnson, a little bit in the middle, 17% of the time. So there's a little bit of a difference of opinion there. No huddle. Cliff Kingsbury used it in 2022 90% of the time. Brian Johnson used it in 2023 17% of the time, and Anthony Lynn used it in 2021 61% of the time. So you've got some differences there, but I think you're going to see a little bit of a blend of all of it. And then shotgun percentage, Cliff Kingsbury's in shotgun 90% of the time, Brian Johnson 93% of the time, Anthony Lynn only 61% of the time. So I kind of look at it's like the Goldilocks, right? Too cold, too warm, just right. And I think that's what you have here, and you're going to kind of blend all these personalities together. On defense, I don't think there's really going to be much fusion at all. I think it's what Joe Witt Jr. wants, and I think it's what Joe Witt Jr. has been ready to execute since he said 2015. The funny thing is he's never been a coordinator before, so we don't really have specific Joe Witt Jr. tendencies, and I don't think it would be fair to Coach Witt to kind of look at Dan Quinn's tendencies and say, well, that's probably what Coach Witt's tendencies are, because he's definitely his own man. And then you look at his coordinators, right? Jason Simmons, defensive pass game coordinator. That's been his job since 2020. He's never been a defensive coordinator himself. He doesn't have a run game coordinator, but he has a pass rush specialist, Ryan Kerrigan, so he's going to help there as well. But I think Joe Witt Jr., you look at the difference in the way the two staffs are put together. You've got two very experienced pass game, run game coordinators on the offense to help the offensive coordinator. And on the defensive side of the ball, you do have a defensive pass game coordinator, but as Coach Simmons has told us here on the program, his job is really to do what Joe Witt Jr. needs him to do, whether that's crafting something, deciding something, whatever it is, that's what he needs to go ahead and do. Ravi came through in the mailbag, said someone on Twitter mentioned if the team were to trade for Brandon Ayuk, the San Francisco 49ers wide receiver, considering his TikTok thing with his call to Jane Daniels, then the team should trade wide receiver De'Ami Brown and a 2025 second rounder and fourth round pick. I said it would be an interesting offer and something to consider. Do you think it's too high, too low, or just right? So we had a pretty extensive conversation about the Brandon Ayuk, Jane Daniels connection and situation with Brandon Ayuk in San Francisco 2 episodes ago. If you missed that, please go check that out. It's right there in the very first segment, so you won't be able to miss it too long. But we did not get too deep into the compensation because essentially the crux of the conversation is I don't think San Francisco is trading him. So if Brandon Ayuk comes to Washington, it's most likely going to happen in 2025 via free agency. But if you want to talk trade, I think the leverage here with San Francisco is not with the player, because if you're willing to trade him, then basically the person you're talking to is going to know you're probably not keeping him. You're not going to be able to extend him. Therefore, he's going to become a free agent. So basically what I'm doing is I'm getting him a year sooner than I would otherwise. Where the leverage is for the 49ers and GM John Lynch is creating a bidding war, because this is a player that many teams are going to be in on. And for that reason, I think the price is reasonable. It's a little bit higher than I'd like to go. Like in a vacuum, if I'm going to give you De'Ami Brown in return, then I'd like that second to come in 2025. So I'm going to give you De'Ami Brown in 2024, second round pick in 2025. The fourth round pick is going to come in 2026. But then I'm going to ask you for a 2025 fifth in return to kind of sweeten the pot just a little bit. So that's probably where I would go. But again, the bidding war is going to make it necessary that you pay as much upfront, call it a down payment or whatever you want to call it, as possible. So yeah, I think because of the bidding war that would happen, if the Niners actually put Brandon Ayuk on the market seriously, then yeah, I think that's a fair enough value. So many thought that Martin Mayhew would be fired when Ron Rivera was fired, but Adam Peters kept him. And the reason for that is trust. The very word the new regime is trying to build this franchise around. We talk more about that coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And this episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, and you can bet on all of that baseball over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers, you can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can then use to bet on everything, including who might take the next pitch out the yard. The Washington Nationals are in action Thursday afternoon and are favored to win by 1.5 runs over the visiting Arizona Diamondbacks. Mackenzie Gore is on the mound for Washington, or at least scheduled to be. And scheduled to be on the mound for Arizona is Ryan Nelson. Nelson allowed a .368 batting average last year against the Nationals, gave up 3 runs, and struck out just 3 batters in the process. So if any of that intrigues you, head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon, add a big win to your summer bucket list. Even if that doesn't, you can find anything else you want to bet on over at FanDuel. Again, that's FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Wrapping up today's mailbag episode of Locked On Commanders. We're hitting up Fran. Insider Fran hit us up, said, what exactly is Martin Mayhew's role with the Commanders now? Is he a valuable asset? This is another question that Fran actually asked a little while ago. And Fran, another question that yes, it got pushed back because of some of the other things going on, but also gave us an opportunity to really kind of look at this staff and look at what they're doing, look at how they're operating, and really kind of get a gauge on here. So for those who don't know, Martin Mayhew is now the senior personnel executive and advisor to the general manager. And basically what that tells you is Adam Peters trusts him. Just think about this. If you had to hire someone to be an advisor to you, are you going to hire someone to be your advisor that you don't trust? No, this is not a keep your enemies closer type of situation. So clearly, Adam Peters trusts Martin Mayhew, and he trusts him fully. And even you should even kind of gauge how much he trusts him even higher, because think about this. Martin Mayhew just came from this previous staff. Like Martin Mayhew worked with Ron Rivera, in some sense worked for Ron Rivera. The roster that was built, Martin Mayhew has his fingerprints on. Not saying that he signed off on every decision or agreed with every decision or what have you, but Martin Mayhew was part of building that roster. So when you're kind of when you're one of the foremen of a construction crew that built this building, and then a new construction company is called in, I'm using an analogy that I'm going to lose grip of, but a new construction company is called in. They say, hey, look, this building's not that great. We need you to tear down what you need to tear down, build it back up. And here's the crew that built this thing in the first place. To look at one of those people and say, hey, listen, I trust you to not only be on part of my crew to rebuild this thing, but to not be so ego-driven that you try to protect what you've already built. Because, I mean, that's kind of a natural part of the NFL, right? In fact, that's kind of what got Ron Rivera in trouble in the first place, is being so headstrong about this guy is someone that I think is going to be a starter in the National Football League. You got guys on this team who he basically forced into being starters on this team that right now don't have an NFL team to play for. And so Martin Mayhew could be part of that regime. And you could kind of look at someone and say, hey, are you going to be able to get past this? And when we tear down over half of this roster in one offseason, are you going to be able to do this ethically, put your ego aside? Because again, you have an ego. It's a matter of putting it aside and not letting it run you and do it. And so to keep him around, obviously Adam Peters trusts him a lot more, than I think a lot of people realized when he came in. Because again, Martin Mayhew was being projected by a lot of people to be getting fired, pretty quickly after the offseason began. So yes, I think he brings value, because if Adam Peters trusts him, then obviously there's a lot of value there. Julian also came through. Do you play fantasy football? And if so, do you have any players from Washington for us to keep an eye on? Julian, yeah, I appreciate the question. Hope you're doing well. That question came in again a little while ago, but fantasy football really kind of a late spring, early summer conversation. So I kind of kept that to the side until we got to this moment, and that's where we are. So Jaden Daniels, I think the quarterback obviously is going to have some fantasy value where you draft them. is going to depend on a couple of things. One, when are you drafting? Are you drafting before the preseason, after the preseason, during the preseason? That's going to make an impact. How many quarterbacks do you have? I've played in leagues that have 2 starting quarterbacks. I don't really like it, but I've done it. And even if you so I play in a 12-team league. We have 1 starting quarterback, so obviously you can have a backup if you want. So you're talking 24 to 32 quarterbacks are going to get drafted, theoretically. That means 8 NFL quarterbacks probably aren't going to be on a roster on a regular basis. Do I think Jayden Daniels has the potential to put up better fantasy numbers than 8 other NFL quarterbacks? Yeah, absolutely I do. So I think Jayden Daniels is certainly draftable, whether you take him as your starter, which would be bold, or if you take him as a backup and just kind of be like, yeah, let's see how this goes. Maybe play the matchups depending on who your starting quarterback is, all of those things. Look, if you go after Aaron Rodgers, because, a lot of people went after Aaron Rodgers very early last year and got bit. Maybe you go after Jayden Daniels. If you lose A-Rod again, at least you got this kind of young, dynamic guy who literally every snap of the ball can get you points. Brian Robinson Jr., the running back, I think he's another guy that you got to consider. You might get a little bit of a late round boost for him. I think the value there might be really good because, again, a lot of people outside of Washington think that Cliff Kingsbury is just going to pass, and Brian Robinson's value is probably going to get hurt by that. So you might be able to sneak that one in there, and I think Brian Robinson's going to get a lot more action than people give him credit for here right now in the offseason. Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, I think those are your only 2 receivers. I don't know that I would draft Jahan right off the bat. If you're a little bit nervous about that, I don't necessarily blame you. But Terry McLaurin, I think, just even from a targets perspective, certainly worth putting on your draft board. How your roster's shaping out and things like that are obviously going to play a part on that. And then the defense. So if you play in a defense/special teams league like I do, you might want to look at Washington and stream them from time to time. Look, if the New York Giants don't come out too hot, if the Philadelphia Eagles kind of struggle getting their feet under them with Kellen Moore as their new offensive coordinator, then they might be worth some streams. Plus, remember, Washington's playing a last place schedule. Some of these teams are last place in their divisions for a reason. So you might be able to take advantage of that with the Commanders defense. If you have an IDP, individual defensive player, this is something that's interesting. Not a lot of leagues do it. I play in an IDP league. I think Quan Martin is an interesting prospect to be an individual defensive player. He's a downhill type of player, so he can make some tackles. I think that he's going to get some opportunity to blitz under Joe Wade Jr., so maybe some sacks, forced fumbles potentially coming there. And then, look, if this pass rush is getting home, safeties like Quan Martin, they can break on a quarterback real fast and end up with some interceptions running the right way for you. And then linebacker Frankie Louvu, I think, is going to be an interesting prospect as well. I want to get more into training camp, more into the preseason to really see how Joe Wade Jr. is going to employ him before I would necessarily advise considering Frankie Louvu. But yeah, I do think there's a handful of Washington Commanders players that you could go out there and draft. There's always teams that are, in my book, are on the undraftable list. I kind of always have like a handful of teams that I just say they're undraftable. The Tennessee Titans are going to be one of those teams this year. I'll tell you that right now. The Carolina Panthers are going to be one of those teams this year as well. But the Washington Commanders certainly not one of those teams. They will have some players that are draftable in fantasy football. And of course, we will talk more about fantasy football as we get closer into July and then into training camp. And then as drafts get going, we'll have those conversations as well. Come back tomorrow. We'll have another episode of Locked On Commanders to wrap up this week. In the meantime, you got questions or comments, you just throw them down in the YouTube comment section or text me directly by becoming a Locked On Commanders insider at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. We had a YouTube question that I wanted to get in on this episode, wasn't able to, so we will answer that question on Friday. It's not going to be a mailbag episode, but we will use it to help form the construct of the episode. Don't worry. So we're going to get back to that. Don't forget to make sure you check out Locked On Sports Today, the first ever 24/7 live streaming sports channel on YouTube. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day. Thanks for coming through on a regular basis like you do. Until we speak again, if you're out and about, please be safe, be kind, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.